All right, everybody, welcome to another Perceptive podcast live here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. Once again, I am still Josh Spicer, and we got a great cast for you today. Our topic is going to be discussing inspiration in the game industry, or how do you find your next big idea for a video game? And joining me from Sumo Digital, please welcome Joe Kinglake.
Hi there.
Hey Joe, it's great to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. For those of you watching this recorded right now, I'm in the tail end of recovering from a nasty cold, so hopefully my voice won't go out too much tonight, but we'll see what happens. But how are you, Joe? We've been talking about this for I think like the last few weeks. We kind of had to play direct message tag on Twitter, but it's great to finally have our chat today.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry about that. It's been kind of pushed back a few times, hasn't it? But it's great to finally be on. I'm doing great though.
Awesome. So, like I said, for today's cast, we're going to be talking about inspiration in the game industry. But before we get there, for people watching this, could you talk a little bit about your background in the game industry and kind of what you've worked on in the past?
Yeah, sure. So, for me, I've always been super interested in video games and the games industry as a whole. So, kind of as long as I can remember, I've dabbled in, game editors like StarCraft and Half-Life map editors. And then eventually, when I hit high school, picked up Game Maker and started making my own small little games. Mostly kind of homages to the games that I was playing at the time. So I made a lot of Crash Bandicoot style games. Um, and then after that, I decided actually to go study computer games design. So I actually went to study it at the University Campus Suffolk, which is my hometown's university. They actually recently started a computer games design course. So I went and studied there. So since leaving university, I started at Gorilla Cambridge Studio and I worked on Killzone Mercenary for the Vita as a level designer. And that was just mostly kind of assisting the level design team and kind of finding my place in the industry and finding my feet, really. And then after that, I moved to Gorilla Amsterdam in the Netherlands and worked on Horizon Zero Dawn. And a lot of the kind of bulk of my job there was managing all of the players' sort of traversal systems and movement systems, and everyone's favorite, the contextual voice system, so the self-talk system. Since then, I actually moved back a few years ago to England and worked on Star Citizen. So that's actually up in Manchester. Worked there for about 2 years, and that was as a level designer working on the Squadron 42 single-player campaign. And actually, about 3 or 4 months ago, I left the Foundry 42 team to join Sumo Digital to work on an unannounced title as a game designer again. So I've kind of bounced a lot between game and level design.
And for those of you watching this, either live or recorded, I already spoke to Joe about. I know I'm not going to be grilling him over what their next project's going to be, so Joe doesn't have to worry about that for today.
I appreciate it.
But definitely a very interesting path or a game career path there, Joe, from working on going from the Killzone for the PSP to Horizon, Star Citizen. I know Star Citizen, that is a very interesting game, and you're probably not the right person to talk to about that, but there's definitely a whole lot of podcast discussions to be had about that game at some point in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's got a grand vision, which I really loved. I mean, that's what first attracted me to it, and there's so much going on there and I think it really is going to turn out to be a quite a special game. So I'm really looking forward to what the talented guys over there who are still working on it, what they're going to produce.
And then, of course, Horizon Zero Dawn being another very interesting one. I played that last year. I actually played it a few months ago, just right around the New Year or the end of the year sale. It didn't quite hook me, but I played just so many open world games that they started just like blur together. I think once you've played too many of them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the game was in development for a very long time, and I
Hmm.
think when it first started, it was still a fairly new kind of trend in the industry, like the open world games. But then, obviously, because it developed over a long period,
Hmm.
had quite like a tidal wave of them since. But actually, funnily enough, I've only just started playing it since it came out, almost maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it's still very fresh in my mind now.
Great. But it's very interesting, like, and this will probably be a good segue into some of the things we'll be talking about for tonight's cast, about just how wide of a net those games cast in terms of their design and the inspirations behind them. And figuring out what kind of game you want to make or what inspires you to make a game design is a very tricky topic. I wrote a post, again, for those of you watching this live, will probably be a few days ago, but recorded will probably be a few weeks. But I talked about one of the challenges of keeping yourself in the game industry, and this is more for independent developers, but even studios can also run into this in trying to decide what's your next big game that you're going to work on. And as I'm sure you're no doubt aware of, Joe, it's very easy to sit around and come up with who knows how many different ideas. But trying to figure out what idea you want to take further, that's a completely different endeavor in of itself.
Oh, definitely. I think like finding an idea is almost a penny for a pound. Like they're very,
Mm-hmm.
very common to have an idea. I think it's finding an idea that obviously you want to work on for a long period of time, but also finding something that really hooks you and something that's special. That's the real art. And then obviously jumping in and actually making it, it's a whole other challenge within itself.
Mm-hmm. And one of the more interesting points that will kind of lead into when we talk about game jams in a few minutes was that one of my favorite games from Sumo Digital, Snake Pass from last year, that game originally did start as a game jam prototype, correct?
Yeah, yeah. So actually, every few months, Sumo does an internal games jam. I think it's a fairly recent thing, but we do an internal game jam for the developers across all of the studios. Um, and obviously, like that can be used to create new IPs, as we saw with like Snake Pass, which did great for obviously both the guy who designed it in the jam, and obviously it's kind of done well commercially, but also it's just such a great way for cultivating like skills and concepts, and you know, getting developers like an opportunity to be able to scratch that creative itch.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really awesome thing to have internal jams, and I know a lot of games companies are starting to take on board that concept.
Mm-hmm. And like the first one that I heard that did that was of course Double Fine with their I think it's Amnesia Fortnite jam. They usually I think they do like every few months or once a year.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's the Double Fine one's a really famous one, I think, and there's a few others as well that have caught my eye over the years. I think Criterion do them, and Bethesda does their jam on their current projects as well. I think they released like a video a while back showing all of the concepts for Skyrim that actually came out of a games jam.
And again, it's just very crazy how many about how developers are now doing more of this in terms of these internal game jams to try and keep these ideas fresh, and of course to give everyone a chance to stretch their creative muscles from now and again.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said before, it's kind of like scratching a creative itch.
Hmm.
It's a really, really great way to just kind of broaden obviously what you're working on day to day, because as much as you love the projects that you're working on every day,
Hmm.
it's really nice to be able to work on something different, but it also kind of puts you in another way of thinking, and allows you to kind of take those concepts that you learn within the games jam and apply them to your current project.
Hmm. And you just never know again where or when lightning will strike, and you get that really amazing idea.
Yeah, exactly. I think games jams are a great way to kind of incentivize creativity, and almost force yourself to be creative and come up
Hmm.
with a new idea.
Hmm. For sure. And excuse me. And I guess here's my first question for you about that then, Joe. When like how many game jams have you participated in so far?
So over university, I got kind of the game jam fever, as it were, and I think probably since starting university, I've done something like 30 or 40 games jams. Um, so I really had a long period where I was using that to kind of drive my creative skills and also my technical skills to kind of bolster my portfolio as well, so that I could get into the games industry.
Hmm. I guess for you, what kind of games do you typically like to play? Like, what influences your sense of design?
Um, I guess that's a super interesting question. I think it's two parts. So the types of games that I like to play are super broad. Like I say, at the moment I'm playing through Horizon, but I have a long commute as well, so I'm also playing through Kingdom Rush. But I also play at work at lunchtimes. We play PUBG, so I kind of like a little bit of everything. But then, if I look typically at the kind of games that I've highly regarded, I talk about things like Gone Home and Dear Esther. So I definitely like to kind of dip into all different types of games. Um, but as for what influences me, I guess it's a really tricky one. It's such a wide topic. I think like anything from movies and films to art, um, but also just kind of things like Games Jam, where it's kind of applied limitations and um, just experiences and everything as well. So it really, I think inspiration can come from anywhere.
Hmm. And it's one of those reasons that I hear from a lot of developers who say that don't limit yourself to just playing one specific game or one specific genre, because you can really see some very interesting games come from people who try to branch out like that. Like a few weeks ago, we talked about the game Victor Vran from Hegemon Games, who are normally meant do city builder style games, and this was their first real attempt at ARPG design, and it worked really well just by being different from what we expect from that genre.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think because you aren't necessarily playing only that single genre, you actually have a different expectation of what that genre should be, so you interpret it differently.
Hmm.
But also, if you do play other genres and you get your influence from other media and just other sources, then I think it makes it much easier to kind of subvert the standards of that genre.
Hmm. Now, getting back to going from a game jam to taking that one step further, I guess one interesting question I want to ask you, Joe, and this is one that I'm sure every developer has thought about, especially on the independent side. How do you know when you have something? When you have that, certain, magic in a bottle or lightning in a bottle that you can say, okay, we can maybe take this further.
I think it's both a creative and a technical skill to know when something is worth taking forward. Because I think, in a way, if you're creative enough, you'll be able to kind of derive something special from almost anything,
Hmm.
But on a technical level as well, like it actually really is, I think, a skill that you have to practice. So I think it's worth, when you have an idea, prototype it, iterate it, just get something really quick and figure out, is this something that I can use? So I think a lot of it comes down to practice, really.
Hmm. Yeah. And as you just said, Joe, like if you're one of the most challenging aspects about being creative is that you can think of just about anything, and you can just sit there and start prototyping whatever you want, and chances are you could easily make something. But again, as we've said before, one of the hardest aspects of being in the game industry or sustaining yourself is being able to take that idea and say, okay, is this something that I can market towards people? Is this something that, someone other than myself and my five friends are going to enjoy?
Oh, definitely. And I think that's why it's really, really important to, expand your horizons when you're looking for source material
Mm-hmm.
to inspire you. Because I think if everyone starts referencing the same group of games or the same genres, then we start to become a very self-referential medium.
Mm-hmm.
So if you start to look to your own experiences, which is something that no other developer has, so everyone obviously is a combination of their own experiences, then you start to have something a lot more unique. And I think once you have something unique, it becomes a lot more easy to market that to people.
Mm-hmm. And as we've seen over the last few years, especially in the independent side, some of the most popular games that have came from the indie space have been those that have been the respective dream games from a lot of these developers.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of these games that do kind of come almost from nowhere. I mean, a lot of these big games that are coming from first-time developers, they're coming from people who don't have that expectation of the games industry, which I think is great because we're getting all kinds of sources and all kinds of new people within the industry and just keeping it really, really fresh. And I think that's really the best thing that can happen to our industry.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess for you, Joe, what kind of, I guess, we already talked about some of the games you're inspired by, but in terms of some of the games you've made, like through game jams or even just prototyping, what kind of genres do you typically favor, or do you favor any?
So a lot of my games jam games tend to be very, very cubic. I'm not super great at making something look aesthetically really interesting. So a lot of my games tend to kind of favor a design sort of concept or something I'd really like to experiment with, but obviously then I kind of put it in with text or with cubes, so they tend to not be the flashiest looking of games. But in terms of a genre, I think there's not really a particular genre. I can usually, when I look back, I can tell that it's usually inspired by something that's going on in my life, whether it's a game that I'm playing or, a job that I'm in or something that has inspired that game. But I think it's difficult to know exactly what it is at the time that's inspiring that.
Hmm. And yeah, I am the same way. I have no artistic ability whatsoever, so cubes are still beyond me at this point. I can just handle squares right now.
And I think that's fine as well for games jams. I mean, this it's the perfect opportunity to do it, right? Like it's a really safe space to make something, and it's a really great opportunity to leverage your skills to kind of show those skills off. Because obviously, people aren't expecting something that looks, sounds, plays, and everything the best. They're looking for something that really shows off, a piece of who you are or what your talents and skills are.
Hmm. Now, I think another major part of that, getting back to what you said a few minutes ago, regarding having different backgrounds and different experiences. I think that's another area where game jams typically tend to thrive because, as anyone who knows, for most game jams, or I think for every game jam, you're given a specific topic or something that to kind of structure the game jam around. But everyone has their own preconceived notions or their own background with that specific topic, and that can lead to wildly, crazily different games.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, kind of going off on a tangent, I guess, a little. I have kind of a bit of an outlandish theory about creativity, and I kind of feel that it's actually a real tangible skill that you can learn and practice, and it's not actually an inherent thing that people are born with. And I think a lot of the way that you can do that is obviously, as we've already mentioned, is finding and sourcing reference. And a lot of that comes from your own experience as well. So something that other people can't reference, but actually also um, applying limitations, either self-imposed,
Mm-hmm.
like a games jam, or a time limit, or a theme, or actually something that kind of comes naturally out of the world. So, the older PlayStation games had a lot of technical restrictions. So Silent Hill's draw
Mm-hmm.
distance kind of influences the fog. Or if you've got a time by a publisher restriction, then that can really kind of influence how your game is being developed.
Mm-hmm. And as everyone knows, necessity is the motherhood of invention when it comes to just about everything involved.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, if you've got a time limit to fit, I do think that you get very, very creative within that time limit.
Mm-hmm. And of course, taking these ideas further, I guess here's a question for you. Like when you're thinking about a game in a game jam kind of setting or environment, how does that differ from when you're now sitting there going, can I take this further? Like how do you start thinking about things differently, if at all, when you're trying to decide for that next step?
So what I find super interesting about games jams is it's kind of a hyper condensed
Mm-hmm.
version of working on in a studio on a game. It's just that whole 2, 3, 4 year experience squished down into 48 hours. So I think you do kind of have that notion of, okay, could I work on this afterwards? Where could this go afterwards? But I think it's just a very small fleeting moment because you just kind of need to jump in and get the game made, and get something up and running really, really quick. So I do think that, like I say, you do have that moment, but I don't think it's quite as prevalent as when you're working on a larger project where, product development and kind of focus testing and all of that is a lot more applicable in that situation.
Mm-hmm. And that sense of hyper focus when it comes to game jams can, again, it leads to some very fascinating ideas. Now, I guess a few minutes ago we talked about, of course, Double Fine with the Amnesia Fortnite when they do theirs. I guess with Sumo Digital, how long do your game jams usually last for?
So I've only actually done the single Sumo game jam, but when I did it, we had an entire day where we were just working on our games jam games all day, and then I think the games jam lasted for about 2 weeks after that, where you could kind of work on it in your own time as
Hmm.
well. And then afterwards, we had a big kind of get together where we all got to play everyone else's games, and I think it was just a really, really great experience.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's you gotta be really careful about how obviously how long you spend working on these game jam games. I know one of my favorite stories was what happened with Space Base DF9. That was one of the games from Double Fine, and how they kind of stopped working on that game to focus on their game jam, and then they came back and everyone was like, where did the developers go?
I think that's it, though. Games jams, I mean, from a purely kind of commercial and financial point of view, I think they're a really safe way to be able to develop new IPs and test new things out, and also then take concepts and apply them to your wider projects. Because yeah, they're like we said before, they're hyper condensed, and it's a really
Hmm.
short period that you only have to convince, a production team that you're going to spend a single day's worth of work instead of months developing a new IP.
Hmm. Now, I guess moving or switching gears for a second, another aspect behind finding inspiration for game design can obviously be from going outside of the game industry. And this kind of leads back to what we were saying a few minutes ago with everyone having their own background. And it's very interesting, again, looking at things from the double A and independent space of where some of these ideas can come from. So I guess for you, Joe, in terms of looking like outside of the game industry to either other mediums, other markets, other genres, anything like that, what has there been anything that's inspired you or has helped you with your own game design from outside?
Yeah, definitely. I think actually almost some of the best inspiration that I've had across my career has come from actually outside the games industry. Because I think within the games industry, it's taught me obviously the essentials and the expectations of genres and the conventions. But I think outside is where almost the juicier stuff comes from. So, I mean, kind of on a broader level, there's a few books that get shared around quite often within design departments that I've worked within, which is The Design of Everyday Things, which talks about, designs of doors and,
Hmm.
cups and technology and everything. Nothing really specific to games, but, a lot of really common game level design ideas, such as affordances, have come out of that book. And then there's also 101 things I learned in architecture school. And, there's a lot of parallels that you can draw between real world architecture
Hmm.
and level design, because it's all just spatial design.
Oh, yes.
But I guess on a very specific level, for the games that I've worked on, when I was working on Horizon Zero Dawn, like I said before, I was working on the climbing mechanics, and we would have kind of countless arguments about how hands should be placed, what kind of moves could she feasibly do, and how do you climb up a wall, and how should your fingers be positioned when you're holding onto a rock. And at a certain point, it became just a great idea to go climbing and learn how to climb. So that's what me and a few of the guys from the team there did, is we actually went out to the climbing wall locally and just went climbing every Tuesday. And that actually provided some really, really interesting insights into like the mechanics that we were developing that I don't think I would have otherwise been able to gain if it wasn't for going out and experiencing them firsthand.
That sounds great. It all sounds very a little too much for me. I'm gonna stay on the ground for that kind of stuff. But yeah, as you said, it's very interesting to look outside and find some very interesting topics there. I have a friend, an indie developer, who's working on a strategy action game built around Mayan mythology and Mayan architecture. And like he talked about when he was doing research, that there weren't like didn't seem like anyone else was really going that way, and that kind of led him to going or doing that himself. And again, there's just so many interesting topics out there, rife for game design.
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you look at just the whole history of game development, I mean, Miyamoto talks about with Nintendo how Zelda is inspired about him, running around and using
Mm-hmm.
sticks when he was a kid. And I think Edmund Macmillan, I read, I think once before that, the his understanding of like biblical imagery for Binding of Isaac comes from his upbringing. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I think, it's it's really like a wealth of inspiration to look back on your own experiences, for and also your own interests as well, for inspiration for game ideas. A good friend of mine, he worked on like a puzzle game for iPad and iPhone, and it's a really kind of enchanting puzzle game. It's called Ruya.
Hmm.
Excuse me. And he always describes his design process as him wanting to uh, establish kind of the same feelings that he feels when he listens to certain music. He wants to establish those within his games designs and make his users feel the same way, but not through just using the same music, but actually using it, the aesthetics of the music, and to derive new mechanics.
Hmm. And again, you just never know when that kind of inspiration will strike. And I guess another really great example, one that I liked, was from Crow Team, and how the team there is very interested in historical architecture. It's why they base Serious Sam out of Egypt, and how they use a Greek, Egyptian, I think medieval architecture for the Talos principle.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like those are something that that is definitely something the team is super interested in. And you can see it across all kinds of games that the interests of the developer really start to seep through into the game. I think even if it's not intended, they just do naturally.
Hmm. Now, I guess taking that a step further, though, I guess here's a question I want to ask you, Joe, about looking outside the game industry and trying to bring that in. Obviously, as you just said with your friend who's making the puzzle games, it's not always like a straight one to one. Like, if I want to make a game about, I don't know, let's say I'm going through my head here. I know about ant hills. Like, let's say you're very interested in ants and how ant society works. It's not as simple as saying I'm just going to take this. I'm going to build a game around the next 6 to 12 weeks. There, you have to be able to extrapolate from your inspiration just what exactly you want the player to experience, just as you said with your friend. So for you, when you're thinking about like outside inspiration or looking at other things for game design, how do you begin to, I guess, put the two together and say, I have this crazy inspiration, but what do I actually do with that for a video game?
I guess I mean, that's a great question. I think it's a really tricky one to answer,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess it's like you say. I think it's about trying to understand a piece of work or an experience, and trying to really like extrapolate what the feelings or the experience of that was, and then trying to derive mechanics from that. So I think like a really great example for me is Monument Valley. How they obviously they looked at Escher paintings. I mean, I assume I assume they looked at Escher paintings, and obviously they took the aesthetic of that kind of impossible architecture, but then they derived game mechanics out of that. So it's not just a background and then they've overlaid a very simple platformer over it. They've actually really thought about how would you move around in that space and how does it affect every other mechanic and every other decision within the game.
Mm-hmm. And like that kind of design, it certainly takes a while to start to build all those connections up. And I guess here's a question for you. Are you a fan of like the puzzle genre? Because again, we can see just so many crazy inspirations and just very unique designs from that respective genre.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a big fan of puzzle games.
Hmm. I mean, I guess for me, like I've been getting into stuff like The Room. I think that was one that came out a few years ago. Your typical adventure games, even like logic-based puzzles as well.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a lot to be said about drawing on real life experiences for something that's quite abstract, like a
Hmm.
puzzle game, because obviously it's not necessarily something that you would really you really kind of have a an exact copy of within the real world. So I think you have to distill down whatever it is you're trying to make
Hmm.
to get that new core experience.
Hmm. Now, taking this back to like game jam games, or taking a game jam game and going further with it. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Joe, is being able to refine this idea or iterate on it. because one of the harder aspects, and one thing that I think a lot of first-time indie developers tend to struggle with, is being able to refine these ideas. Because while we've seen some of the most amazing and unique games from the independent space, we've also seen some of the most rough games from the independent space. I've played my fair share of games that just feel very awkward to control, very weird to play. So, I guess from that point of view, how do you take a crazy idea or some crazy concept that you put into a game jam and try to make that something that's more appealing again to people outside your respective circles?
I guess it's kind of two parts really. I'd say the first is really it's just practice. I mean, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, a lot of my first games were
Mm-hmm.
just homages to the games that I was playing, and when I say homage very loosely, of course, it's but with practice, then you start to create more interesting and unique ideas. So it's really just got to keep trying and keep making new games. And I think games jams are a fantastic way to do that because they're so short. It's almost throwaway. It's just one weekend that you can spend, and then you've got a new game and you've learned a whole bunch of new stuff. And I think the other part is really just to not be precious about your ideas. And I think that kind of goes for the wider industry, like as well. I think it's a very practical skill to know when you should throw away an idea and
Oh,
understanding that
yes.
that's okay because it's not necessarily wasted time. You've still learnt something from it. You've still gained something from it. You still got an extra game on under your portfolio. So it's all really valuable. But again, like I say, it's important to know when you should cut ties with it.
Hmm. And that can be very tricky for a lot of developers. Again, because when you put all your thoughts and creativity into an idea, you typically want to see that through all the way. But sometimes the idea just is not coming together all the way. And it can be very dangerous to, overcommit to a project.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's probably why I see a lot of independent developers talk about the idea that your first game shouldn't be the your dream game that you
Hmm.
always want to work on because you're still in that period of learning and figuring out not only, what does the gaming community want from a game, but also figuring out your own skill set and your own knowledge of the tools and your own creative skills as well.
Hmm. Now, I guess another question I want to ask you about, Joe, with coming up with these new inspirations and these new games, one of the things that we've really seen, especially at our game jams, have been embracing unique peripherals and unique control schemes. I believe that game, what was it? Was it Sebastian, Johann Sebastian
Oh, Johann
Joust, or
Sebastian Joust,
yeah,
yeah.
that one. I'm sure that came from a game jam, right? Or am I just imagining that?
I'm not 100% sure,
Hmm.
but either way, yeah, I think like utilizing like weird and crazy peripherals is just a fantastic way to push the industry forward. And like I said before, it's a really safe place to do it. So you can try out some crazy control method, and if it works, then fantastic. Maybe that's something that we can take forward as the industry. And if it's something that is way too crazy and will never work, well, then it's only a weekend of time that's lost.
I guess for the game jams you participated in, Joe, were there any like really standout, like crazy ideas or crazy peripherals that you got a chance to experience?
Um, I'm looking back. I remember one which wasn't necessarily crazy peripherals, but I'd seen a puzzle game that was developed by a team of, I think, a couple of people, and they had about 8 or 9 devices, like iPads and phones, across the table, and you were playing it across all of those different devices. And I remember that standing out as being particularly quite awesome. But other than that, it seems to mostly be, the use of kind of the outdated peripherals and then kind of revitalizing them. So actually, I see it a lot at games jams, people using the Connect, which I think is fantastic because I think that's something that we, as the industry, just kind of breezed past, and maybe we didn't give it enough credit. And I think maybe there is still something there, and indie developers who are participating in games jams might actually be the ones to breathe new life into that device.
Yeah. You never know, right? Again, that's the beauty of the game industry. You never know what crazy idea will, strike everyone's interest.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're still in such a young period within the games industry that I really think that anything could happen.
Hmm. I know we've been joking about how this is going to be the year of PUBG, so who knows what 2019 will bring in terms of the genre everyone's going to be looking at.
Yeah, I mean that's it. Games like PUBG, it's almost seemingly from the wider community's perspective, at least, it's kind of popped out of nowhere, and now it's like a almost a cultural phenomenon within the games industry,
Hmm.
and there seems to be a lot of companies that are trying to make something similar, or that are really trying to build on that. And I think maybe the same will happen this year, that we'll get a game that really captures the imaginations of the gaming community as a whole, and then together we can build on that as well.
Hmm. Now, here's an interesting tangent for you, Joe. Keeping with the theme of like unique control schemes and designs, we've seen again a very wide share of crazy ideas. I mean, right now everyone is kind of waiting to see what's going to happen with the Nintendo Lago in a few months, or Lago. I always mix up the term there, but of course. There's just so many very interesting aspects out there. I guess for you, are there any unique control schemes or designs that really piqued your interest, whether they came from a game jam or just finding them in like the independent or AAA space?
Um, for me, actually, I'm glad you mentioned Johann Sebastian Joust before, because that is a game that at every jam I always think that if I could make that, then that would make me the happiest designer ever. It's a game that I've put so many hours into, and every time I see it at an event, it just makes me so happy, and I really kind of captured my imagination. Um, I can't think of anything other actually the Nintendo Lago, is that the cardboard
Yeah.
Nintendo? I think that's fantastic. I have no idea what to expect, but it's really piqued my curiosity. So I'm really excited to see what's come out of that. But I
Mm.
guess from a crazier point of view or level, I went to the Unite conference a few years back, and actually they had a game there which was controlled by a table flipping remote, and effectively the game was you flipping a table, and it was absolutely fantastic. It was so visceral that you were actually involved within the game, and I definitely think there's something said to be said for those really kind of like contextual controllers like
Hmm.
that.
That just reminded me of the Phoenix Wright series when you scream objection and the game goes off. I think those two need to get together. Table flipping and
Yeah,
just screaming objection at people. I,
definitely.
that would be perfect. Now, I guess for people watching this, and again, with the idea of participating in game jams, what are some of like the big name game jams that if you could recommend them for people to either take notice of, or if they have the chance to participate with?
So the Global Games Jam, I'd say, is definitely one of the most accessible ones. It happens every year. It's actually just been about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I think it's usually the last weekend of January every year. But that one, they encourage venues worldwide to open up to everyone, and you get huge groups of people come in and participate. And I think they have something like 10,000 people participating, and it's not necessarily a competition. It's really kind of in the spirit of making something new and kind of scratching that creative itch, like we were saying earlier. And that's a fantastic one. It's very accessible for people of all levels. And I'd say also another really fantastic one to compete in is the Ludum Dare event, and that happens every 3 or 4 months, I think it is, and that's actually an online one, so you can kind of do it in the comfort of your own home. And that one usually the community gets to vote on the themes as well, which I think is kind of there's a really nice community around the Ludum Dare um,
Hmm.
jam. And what's really great about it as well is you all get given a few weeks afterwards to play everyone else's game, so you really get involved within the whole process.
Hmm. I know when we last spoke about game jams, I forget the guest I had on. We talked about the train jam when they do the game jam while on
Oh
a
yeah.
train.
Yeah, so I've not actually done that, but I would love to do the train jam.
I'm just waiting for someone to get really mad about just make like a murder mystery train jam game there right there.
Yeah, I bet there's some really interesting jam games come out of there. I think Ludum Dare did one a few years back, which I think was called the Nano Ludum or Nano Dare or something like that. And instead of 48 hours, it was 48 minutes that you
Oh,
had to make a
jeez.
game. And I saw a friend of mine had done it, and the game he made, I had no idea how he put this together in 48 minutes, but it was honestly fantastic. And I guess once you're put into that situation where you're almost forced to be creative, then you start to come up with interesting ideas.
Nice. All right, I'm going to do a quick time check here. We're about 40 minutes into our chat, so I think we'll probably be taking this to the hour. So, with that said, for those of you watching this live, if you have any questions for Joe regarding inspiration, game jams, or anything like that, please get them in the next few minutes. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else we haven't discussed. So I guess for you, Joe, is there anything that you were thinking about discussing on the cast that we haven't gone to yet?
Um, yeah, I guess just kind of going back to what we were saying earlier about how limitations can influence new and interesting ideas. I think it's actually important to kind of consider what kind of limitations you can impose on yourself, because obviously I think games jams are like a really great one that you can impose. But I think there's some really interesting ones if you kind of think about the genre standards. You know, how could you subvert a genre? How what would a
Mm-hmm.
genre of a game look like without a mechanic? Or what would a paradoxical limitation like a war game without guns look like? Or a zombie game without blood? I guess that'd probably be Plants versus Zombies or something. So I think it's definitely a really important point to kind of
Mm-hmm.
question, the thing that it is that you're making.
Mm-hmm. Now you also have to be really careful about that in terms of how far do you get away from a theme before it's no longer a part of that theme. And as we've said before, when it comes to game design or specific genres, there are some very preconceived notions and foundational stuff that if you get rid of, it's very hard to call that game still part of that genre. Like if you have a roguelike that you know it's all one linear level and there's no way of randomly or procedurally generating content, people may find that hard pressed to say this is still a roguelike style game.
Yeah, and I guess it's just about assessing what it is that you really want to make. If it is
Mm-hmm.
something, if you're really wanting to make a roguelike game, then obviously it's a really great exercise to kind of question what would a roguelike look like without procedurally generated dungeons, or what would it look like without loot, for example, or what would it look like with no graphics or with X kind of graphics. But obviously, you're really wanting to make a roguelike game at a certain point, like you say, you start to move away from the genre.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just kind of important to assess what it is that you really want to make.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess here's another kind of tangent for you. In terms again of like outside inspiration, one of the more popular ones that I've seen that I've talked to developers about is, of course, looking at history. Different periods of life and areas that we normally don't see games come from, such as I said earlier, with Mayan architecture. I guess for you, are there any aspects or I guess esoteric inspirations that you like that you haven't seen come from a video game yet?
Um, I guess that's a tricky one for me. Let me think. Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, like the most interesting games, like I've said before, like I'm really interested in knowing about a person's experiences and what makes them them. And like you say, I think there's definitely something within historical aspects, especially from countries that, I don't know as much about, but also within language and, languages that I don't speak. And I'm sure there's all kinds of media, like especially written media within those languages that I would love to see games derive from that obviously I probably wouldn't have access to otherwise.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think I am actually running out of questions. I know we could easily jump into talking about like Horizon or Star Citizen, but that may be a little too much for our cast here. Let me see. Uh, here's one. Here's a question from Chantel. What is the next challenge you'd like to set for yourself personally slash completely new skill you'd like to learn in the next jam you participate?
So that's actually my wife. um, so thank you, Chantel. Um, so the next challenge that I'd like to set for myself personally when I set a jam, when I work in a jam, I guess it would really to be to work on something like we mentioned before with a unique control scheme, or something, some kind of really contextual input mechanism. That's something
Hmm.
that every single jam I've always had in the back of my mind that I really want to do, and I think that's actually a really, maybe the next jam I should really jump in and actually just do that.
I guess for me, like some of like the more crazier things, like the one I always had trouble with personally is like motion based or very crazy things you're supposed to do with your body and stuff like that. But I know
Hmm.
there are people who love those kinds of games.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I don't think I could necessarily see myself spending, a couple of hours a week in front of the TV, jumping around in front of the Kinect, but definitely I could see myself, enjoying that experience in maybe the hour or two that I did play it. For example, actually, at one of the Game Hack Games Jams that I went to in London, which was kind of a semi-regular one, which really, really encouraged that kind of, game development. It's sort of thinking a bit more outside the box. One of the developers had actually made a game where you went shopping and you're just walking down the aisle and you're picking up your groceries, but you had to do it
Oh no.
using the Kinect controls, and it was all kinds of peculiar. You see people jumping around all around all the whole screen, and it's really exciting to see. And that's definitely something that I'd really really I think I'd enjoy probably working on more than I'd enjoy playing. But I think it'd be really, it'd be a great learning experience.
Now, speaking about interesting new designs, I guess here's a question for you, Joe. Have you done anything with like VR or the VR-based peripherals? And if so, what are your thoughts on the VR market and where we're at now?
So I've never worked on anything VR. It's definitely something that really, really interests me. I'd be keen to kind of give it a go because I think it's a really, really interesting concept that I think that we've only really just started to brush away at the surface. Because I think once we first got VR, the instinct of everyone was to, okay, let's make this game but VR. So that actually the very first experience I played was Half-Life 2 in VR, and it didn't grab me, and I think I had quite a pejorative view towards VR for a long time because that was the only experience that I had. But then more and more recently, I've started to play games that were really designed for VR, and to be honest, I think that we're in that almost the renaissance of VR. I think we've not kind of yet grabbed what it is that's really special about it, but I think there are definitely some games out there that are really, really starting to shine through and show us like what the the next step of the industry could look like.
Hmm. Yeah, it's something that'll be interesting to see what goes on with VR because we've yet to really see that breakout mainstream hit. I think a lot of developers were hoping to get by now, and it seems like right now a lot of us, in terms of that kind of uniqueness, it seems that that's become shifted towards the Nintendo Switch, which for 2017 I think they've reported having one of their most profitable years with it.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess the problem really lies within the price of the
Hmm.
peripherals because not only are you now required to buy a console, but then you have to buy expensive peripherals.
Hmm.
And then you're also counting on the fact that developers are going to be making games that are, and I really think they do need to be exclusive for the VR to be really
Yeah.
special. So it's something that I don't think a lot of consumers are really they've really sold on the idea of it yet, or they're not willing to take that risk. And I think something like Nintendo Switch, when you've got that first party support, where you
Hmm.
know that there's going to be some first party games that are coming out to support that device, it really gives the people trust. And
Hmm.
when you've got games like Zelda and Mario coming out that are specifically designed for this device, then yeah, like I say, there's a lot of trust there between the consumers and the device.
Hmm. And that, as you just said, Joe, that first party support is a very big deal. And one of the reasons why in the AAA market, it really does become limited to the major platform supporters in terms of these crazy peripherals. Again, the Wii U, Xbox Connect, PlayStation Move, and the like. If some random third-party developer decides to come with their own peripheral, most people aren't really going to trust that. And we kind of saw what happened there with the whole rock band rise and fall over. Oh, geez, I don't even know how many years it's been at this point. It seems like it's been forever since we've heard of the whole music-based peripheral genre.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was a really, really interesting sign of like what the industry could do,
Mm-hmm.
with introducing new peripherals. And that was a completely new control mechanism. And obviously, it's derived from something within the real world, so it's kind of easy to understand. But I think the real mistake that we made within the industry was not figuring out something else that we could do
Mm-hmm.
with those peripherals because we limited ourselves by only making a single set of games. And instead of really taking it in all kinds of directions. And how easy that would be to do, I mean, maybe that's just easier for me to say.
Mm-hmm.
I guess tinted glasses and all of that. But I do think that that's really what we need to do with those kind of devices like VR is we really need to kind of expand out and figure out, okay, what's special about this? How can we subvert the expectations? How can we twist it? How can we get something new out of this device?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it's one of the reasons again why I think Nintendo Switch is doing so well. That once again you have this just completely crazy Joy-Con system and how the Switch is hooked up. But again, it's being supported by one of the big three console developers in the world. So
Exactly.
you're not like if you buy the Switch, there's going to be games for it. It's not like I'm going to buy this and then 2 months from now I'm going to get a big news piece that says no one's making games for it anymore. It's dead.
Exactly, and I think that's it. Like Nintendo really committed to the
Mm-hmm.
new device and the new peripherals, and I think that's what's really exciting about Nintendo Lago is because if they can really give that same kind of support to this completely new and exciting
Mm-hmm.
idea, then actually maybe we'll start to see like a real twist on the games that we're playing.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of going back to what you were saying about, the first party platform holders being the ones introducing those devices, I think that's a super interesting point
Mm-hmm.
because I think we have seen a lot of um, VR devices try to take off the ground and really struggle because they don't have that
Mm-hmm.
support. So I guess a lot of it will come down to um, once those devices become a lot cheaper to make, then it will be easier for developers to give support because in turn they'll be easier for consumers to buy.
Yeah, and I think building off of that, I think another major point is during these I guess the early years of the infancy of some of these new peripherals and these new devices, it's very hard for the consumer to once again know what the standard is. Like for us older folks watching, of course, we remember the days of Betamax versus cassette tapes as the big format war of the '80s. And it's very hard for the consumer to know, okay, do I spend the $600 on this thing or do I spend the $600 on this thing? Because again, once you buy something, you're kind of locked in at that stage. And it's the same thing with VR when you have the Rift, Vive, a Google Card box, or I'm sorry, Cardboard box, and I'm sure there's even more out there. How do you know which one to, bet the farm on? And again, when you have that first party trust, I mean, Nintendo, you're buying something that's going to stick around. There's not going to be 15 different iterations of the Switch from 15 different developers.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's two-way trust because I
Yeah.
think obviously the players and the gamers they need to know that they can trust that their developers are going to make games for this platform, but then also the developers need to trust in the device as well. They need to trust that people are going to buy it. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, really. I
Mm-hmm.
think. And I guess as these devices, like I said before, as they get cheaper, it will be easier for people to take risks on these devices, both from a developer and a player point of view.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess let me do a quick time check here. Yeah, we're about hit the hour, but here's I guess, a somewhat of a fun question to begin to wrap things up with. Speaking about crazy peripherals and Nintendo, I gotta ask Joe, have you ever had a chance to play the Power Glove or use the Power Glove in the past?
Unfortunately, not. I have seen it, and I would love to give it a go. Um, Actually, the one thing that I did see is I think I'd seen someone had modded one for a flight simulator once before as well, and I think I just think it's just there's a lot of opportunity there because it's obviously something that's so known and understand, moving our hands. So I think I'd really love to see more developers jump on with a peripheral, something like that.
And let's see, Pingu in chat saying, can't wait for a day where VR systems can track your hands without controllers properly. Yeah, that'll definitely be an interesting aspect. And again, anything that can be used to streamline the experience and make it more accommodating towards a larger group of people will ultimately help the market as a whole.
Oh, definitely. I think once we kind of break that barrier and we're able to track your hands, then it reduces the level of difficulty for people to get into that device because all they need to do is just put on the goggles. At the
Hmm.
moment, you've got to put on the goggles and you've got the long cables and then you've got the hand controllers as well, and you have to stand within a certain area, and it's very inaccessible for people who otherwise don't necessarily understand the games industry, or um, but also people who aren't as technologically advanced, because it's not a very default setup at the moment. I guess we're heading that way now that there are first party VR systems coming out, but I still think we've got a little way to go.
Hmm. Not to mention, of course, the space requirement as well. I mean, I'm in this tiny room here. There's no way I'm fitting an entire VR setup here in the near future. And it's very interesting, again, about different markets and uh, different conditions that can impact what kind of game someone can reasonably play.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those are all really important considerations for the developers of these devices that they're going to have to take on board because, like you say, not everyone has 4x4 meters to be able to jump around in their living room, um, safely at least. And so it's definitely something they need to think about. And I think, like Pingu mentioned, being able to track your hands could potentially be the next logical step because whilst it obviously doesn't accommodate you moving around as easily, it does introduce all kinds of new and interesting control schemes that were otherwise not possible.
Hmm. Let me see. I actually have a really interesting question for you, Joe. Getting back to or keeping with this idea of these crazy peripherals, and again, being able to market things to people, because that I think is one of the hardest sells when it comes to taking like a game jam prototype, especially when we talk about those that make use of crazy ideas or very esoteric design, and putting that in the hands of the general consumer. As we just spent like the last 5-10 minutes about, VR right now is kind of in that awkward phase. There are people who are certainly celebrating it, but in terms of putting this in the hands of your general consumer and telling them to go nuts, they're still not really seeing it. So my question for you is, when you're thinking about things from that design and marketability standpoint, when you take something crazy, like again, like even something like Johann Sebastian Joust or that shopping game you mentioned, how do you think about taking something that may have worked in a very confined or very unique situation, and then can you put that in a fully marketed game, or is it one of those things that it may just not fully connect?
I guess think it's kind of a two-part problem, or maybe that way of looking at it is you get kind of two things out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the first is that the lessons like the developers are learning who are making these games, whilst might not necessarily be able to directly replicate that experience, they might inspire new concepts or you might learn new skills and new creative processes that are directly applicable to other games. But actually, for taking those products to a wider market, I think, like you said, that can be a very difficult thing to do, and I think it needs help from the larger, wider markets to support those new peripherals and not even the new peripherals, but the peripherals we already have. And then we also need developers to be making products for those peripherals. So it
Hmm.
needs to be kind of like a symbiotic process between the two developers and platform holders.
Hmm. And I was just looking up another game that I thought about in terms of crazy peripheral or that crazy setup, and it was the Artemis Spaceship Bridge Simulator game, where you're just literally having like 6 people or 3 or 6 people each controlling like a simulation of a starship. And I thought that sounded very cool, but again, like I'm kind of tempered by the fact that there is no way I'll be able to set something like that up here in my house. But again, it's one of those things that you wouldn't really think about doing something like that normally, but if you can get the people around, just like with Johann Sebastian Joust, it can be just an amazing time.
Oh, definitely. And I think that's kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier in the podcast about how games jams actually provide quite a safe place for
Hmm.
the incubation of new ideas. So, like you say, it's probably not an idea that you would work on in a large studio to have 10 people attached to, one game system. But in a games jam, that's something that you can safely test out and get working. And the beautiful thing about games jams is that you tend to have a lot of other people around you, so you can actually test it out and really get a
Hmm.
feel for it. Um, so I do think that games jams really are going to be the place where we're going to see a lot more of these. I mean, we're already seeing it. In fact, all of these really great ideas are coming out of games jams, stuff that otherwise would probably never have been developed because it would have just been too dangerous to develop it within,
Hmm.
a setting that would require financial backing
Yeah.
or would require a lot more time to put towards it.
Of course. All right. Well, I think with that, let's begin to wrap things up. So, for you folks watching this live right now, this is going to be last call for questions. So, if you have anything else for Joe, please get them in the next minute or so. But I guess for you, to begin wrapping things up, are there any final thoughts, or any topics relating to game jams, inspirations, or whatever that you would like to bring up now before we say goodnight?
I guess like the only real thing for me is and it's like I said before, something that I'm a big advocate for is that really I kind of feel that creativity is a skill that is something that you can learn and you can
Mm-hmm.
practice. And yeah, definitely that some people start with a more inherent skill level of it, but I do think that even if you start with very, very little skill, you can practice it, you can get better at it, and it's something very tangible that you can test. Um, so I would say for any developers who are looking to get into the games industry, just really really kind of learn that skill, like expand your source material. Don't just limit yourself to playing games. Watch movies, go to museums, look at art, go experience things, travel the world, and use that to inform your games designs. And really, if you're looking to get into the industry, do take part in games jams because they're really such a fantastic experience to not only like meet other developers, but just to practice your skills and learn. Well, actually, just to fill up your portfolio as well, and
Mm-hmm.
to just really just learn how to be a good designer and how to understand how to develop things.
All right, and yet again, like for myself, I've been watching a lot more shows about like history. I watch a lot of stuff on Discovery, History Channel, and the like. And again, you just never know what's going to pique your interest, and that can take you down some crazy rabbit hole.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's crazy how and when creativity strikes. Sometimes you'll be just sat on the train and you'll see something or someone will say something and you'll remember something and it will just spark all kinds of creative ideas. And I think, for you to go out of your way and actually try to trigger that yourself is a really great thing to do. Like you say, watching history channels, like going to be there in your mind when you're sat there in bed, you're going to be going over the show in your mind. And if you're thinking about how you can apply that to game design, then I think you're going to get some really rich experiences come out of that.
Hmm. All right. So I think with that, let's. I think it's time we can probably say goodnight for now. And again, Joe, thank you so much for coming on today, and definitely the best of luck with whatever. Ooh, excuse me, unnamed project you're currently working at Sumo Digital.
Thank you very much. It's been brilliant being on. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So, with that said, we are going to end things here for our delightful, it's like Saturday, well, almost Saturday evening by my time. I think it's Saturday night where you're at, Joe. Cast for today. So, As always, thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're watching this live or recorded. If you're watching this record and would like to get access to these discussions early and without ads, be sure to check out patreon.com/gwbicer to find out how. And for those of you watching this live, I'll be back later Saturday night for our grab bag stream of random games. For you, Joe, if people want to follow you on Twitter or anything like that, do you have any links you want to mention?
Yeah, sure. So for anyone who's just wanting to follow me and see what I'm up to, or if you want to chat about getting into the games industry, or if you just want to just chat about the games industry in general, you can follow me on my Twitter, which is just Joe Kinglake. So that's just Joe Kinglake. Simple.
All right. And for those of you new watching me and want to follow me, again, my Twitter is at GWBicer. And of course, you can find daily discussions of design here and on GameWisdom.com. But I think that is going to do. If you wouldn't mind holding on Skype for like one more minute, Joe, after we wrap things up.
Yep, that sounds great. Thanks very much for having me.
Not a problem. And if you're watching this and you're either working on a game or just want to talk about game design, we are always looking for new guests for our live and recorded casts. So be sure to get in touch if you're interested. But we're going to end things here for tonight. So once again, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to check back for those regular streams. And I'll be back with more guests in the near future. So until then, have a good night, folks, and take care.